All right, everyone, I'm going to begin the webinar now. We're at the 1 o'clock mark. So good afternoon and welcome to the first installment of a new public initiative hosted by the USAID Institute, Northeast Asia in Focus. For those who've attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to the USAID Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Alec Bowman. I'm the Director of Programs Communications here at the USAID Institute. And for a bit of a brief background on the organization, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide unique opportunities for the public to engage with issues of importance to the region of Northeast Asia. And as Northeast Asia continues to be a region of economic, strategic, and political importance, getting a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities the region faces and areas for further U.S. engagement will be paramount. Northeast Asian Focus targets congressional staff, U.S. executive branch officials, foreign diplomats, and members of the policy and business communities. And today's briefing will cover the current trends for the region, national updates based on the evolving situations in the regions this year. Now, I'd like to get this briefing started with just a couple housekeeping notes for everyone here. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping make this program possible: the Las Vegas Sands, AIG, ConocoPhillips, Fairfield Maxwell, FedEx, and Walmart. And I'd also like to note that during the last 15 minutes or so of the briefing, there will be time for the questions from the audience. So if you have a question you would like our speakers to address, please type in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer. And if you're calling in by phone, you can email USAI@usaidinstitute.org with your question. Now, moving on to today's program. I'd like to introduce our moderator and panelists for this discussion, Tammy Overby. So Tammy is the Senior Director at McLarty Associates and advises clients on Asia and trade matters with a particular focus on Korea. She joined McLarty Associates with 3 decades of Asia work, including 21 years living and working in Seoul. Her most recent experience includes 8 years leading the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Asia team, while also serving as president of the U.S. Korea Business Council. Her extensive experience helps American companies compete and prosper in Asia. She attended many of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiating rounds, often leading the American business delegation to help ensure U.S. firms' priorities were well understood by the negotiating partners. She oversaw the U.S. Coalition for TPP, an alliance led by the U.S. Chamber, the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Farm Bureau, and the Emergency Committee for Trade. In addition, she directed the U.S. Chamber's APEC efforts, which involved leading the Chamber's annual delegation together with the National Center for APEC, the U.S. ASEAN Business Coalition, and business councils. And you'll definitely be able to read more about Tammy in our program found in the chat function in just a few moments. So we're very fortunate to have her join us today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Tammy, now to introduce today's fellow panelists and continue this briefing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks for the US Asia Institute for allowing us this opportunity to talk about Northeast Asia. And for those of you who are geographically challenged, we define Northeast Asia as China, Japan, and Korea. As Alex said, I'm Tammy Overby. I've been covering Asia since 1988, over 30 plus years. When I went to Seoul in '88, many U.S. businesses considered Seoul one of the most difficult places to do business in the world. When I left in 2009, we had just completed a high standard comprehensive free trade agreement. And the American business view was Korea, one of the best places in the world in Asia to do business. So I'll be bringing my Korea hat today. To everyone calling in today from DC and around the country, we want to thank you for joining this inaugural Northeast Asia focus briefing. We know everyone's busy. We appreciate the time that y'all are taking to learn more about Northeast Asia throughout this series. And as part of our Northeast Asia in Focus series, today's briefing is going to provide an overview and updates on the most relevant trade, security, and political issues in Northeast Asia, with a particular focus on China, Korea, and Japan. Please be sure to look out for future sessions of this series on our website and on our social media. I am absolutely honored today to be on a panel with 2 distinguished experts, and I'll be serving a dual role as moderator and the Korea hand. First, I'd like to welcome Robert Daly. Robert is the director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And Robert has compiled an unusually diverse portfolio of high-level work on China. He served as a U.S. diplomat in Beijing, as an interpreter for Chinese and U.S. leaders, including President Carter and Secretary of State Kissinger. He served as head of China programs at Johns Hopkins, Syracuse, and the University of Maryland, and as a producer of Chinese language versions of Sesame Street. So he's got the whole gamut for us. I'd also like to welcome Yuki Tatsumi. Yuki is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center. Before joining Stimson, she worked as a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and as a special assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. There's a lot more detail on these great, very experienced speakers posted in the chat. So we're going to start today by asking Robert to give us some comments, and then we'll move on to Yuki, and then we'll go from there. Robert, the ball is yours.
Well, thanks, Tammy. It's great to be here with you and with Yuki, and thanks to Alec and the US Asia Institute. I'm always glad to work with you. You put on wonderful programs. So I'm going to begin today as something of a grim reaper on the topic of China. There's a bulletin called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was launched by Albert Einstein, and which is still going. You may know them as the runners of the doomsday clock on the internet. The March edition of their bulletin will be dedicated to China, and they asked me to write the introduction and to consider the question of whether the US and China, and therefore the rest of the world, are now involved in a new Cold War. And so I did a deep dive on this. Obviously, I've been thinking about this and related questions for a while. And I find that I can only conclude that, in fact, we are already in another Cold War. I want to be very clear. I am saying this as a description of where we are, not a prescription for where I want us to go. It brings me no joy to say this. The fact that we are in another Cold War is a failing and a tragedy. I've been a career-long engager with China. I'm somebody who still thinks that it is necessary to engage with China. So this is not said in any way as a triumphalist. And so I want to walk you through sort of my logic in coming to that conclusion, and then talk a little bit about what it does and doesn't mean. Why do I conclude that we're already in a Cold War? First, the United States and China are competing all over the world, in every country, at both poles, in outer space, in cyberspace. And they are competing to be the most influential nation in shaping security architectures, trade and financial regimes. Very importantly, they're competing to shape the development, the marketization, and the regulation of new tech. But they are also competing to shape global norms and the values and practices that underlie them. Now, neither country believes that it can create a unipolar world in which it can have the kind of status that the United States had between the end of the first Cold War and the current moment. But both China and the United States is determined to maximize its own influence and to prevent the other's dominance. That's one. Number two is China's rapid military buildup. Now, obviously, when China is building its military, I'm very aware that its capabilities still do not equal those of the United States. Nevertheless, the high capabilities of the United States are the known factor. It's not the variable. It's China's buildup that has been one of the things that brought us to the current moment. And that includes the expansion of China's nuclear forces, which reflects the determination of Xi Jinping, who is the General Secretary of China's Communist Party, his determination that his country will have an armed force, will have a military, quote, commensurate with China's international standing. That's a big change. China's previous doctrine was that its military should be sufficient to China's defense, but now it is commensurate with China's international standing in an era in which Xi Jinping says China is going to take center stage in world affairs. In building up its military, however, I do want to note that China is doing what any large, newly wealthy state in a very rough neighborhood would do. It's not surprising that China is translating its successful development and its wealth into military power. So China is pushing its defensive perimeter outward. It is protecting what it views as its sovereign territory, and it is trying to make the global environment more amenable to China's goals. That in itself is neither surprising nor necessarily nefarious. It really depends on what those goals and what those concepts of sovereignty are. So this global competition is also being carried out at a period in which the US and China particularly, but also other countries, not only the US, have irreconcilable differences in the Western Pacific. And that has brought distrust to a post-1979 high. In 2021, 76% of Americans held negative opinions of China, and at least 62% of Chinese felt the same way about the United States. I suspect that if we did another poll today, we would find that those numbers are even higher. China and the United States then are alienated from each other, another Cold War feature. After 40 years of engagement, we are now alienated from each other, not only at the official level, but also socially and institutionally. This has been exacerbated by COVID, but it wasn't brought on by COVID. The United States and China, of course, are also competing in the realm of ideas. President Biden has said that this is a global competition between the forces of democracy and the forces of authoritarianism. Not the framing that I would describe. If you sort of picture, the Avengers assembling against Thanos in the valley in this final battle to the death between authoritarianism and democracy, the world doesn't work that way. Most countries are amalgams. There are all sorts of different systems in the world, and there is not going to be one final decisive battle that swings things one way or the other. That world's never worked that way. It doesn't quite work that way now. But nevertheless, ideology, different concepts of human flourishing are very much at play here. And as I said, we also have a true security dilemma in the Western Pacific, where China's idea of what would constitute a stable order is at odds with that of the United States, and indeed with that of Japan, South Korea, and a great many other countries. In addition, of course, we now have what we see going on in Ukraine, and we have the February 4th pre-Olympics declaration by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin of what can only be regarded as a quasi-alliance, which stands against many aspects of what the United States calls the rules-based order, and stands against the expansion of NATO. They have a relationship in which they will not always be with each other, but they will never be against each other, as an unlimited partnership that China describes as better than an alliance. So it's going to be hard for China to divorce itself from what Putin is now doing in the Ukraine. So in addition now to that quasi-alliance, we also have beginning to emerge, and this is a big one, mutually exclusive systems in the realms of technology and finance. As China, Huawei, through its other companies, is trying to set the standards for global telecom. The United States and its allies are fighting back. It looks like we will not tolerate each other's presence in each other's systems. So if we end up with mutually exclusive telecom systems, third countries, which don't want to choose between the United States and China, which would rather play them off against each other for maximum advantage, will be forced to choose by the existence of those systems. That could also be true in the realm of finance. If Russia, China, and other countries decide that they want to form an alternative to the American-led SWIFT payment system. And finally, there are no bright spots in the relationship. There is no model currently in operation of successful management of US-China relations in one sphere that might be applied to the relationship as a whole. We don't see any bright spots. And perhaps the most depressing feature of this already, I realize, very depressing litany, Beijing and Washington, we've already flunked the alien invasion test, right? Where we all come together and realize that we're all brothers and sisters on the same earth. COVID should have been that moment, and we failed that in spades. So yes, I do think that we are now in a new Cold War. Is it the Cold War? Is it the previous Cold War? Obviously not. I don't know what it's going to be called, the US-China Cold War, the new Cold War. My suggestion is that we call it Cold War II, using the same stress as World War II, because it emphasizes certain continuities between the first and second Cold War. Please do not call it Cold War 2.0. Cold War 2.0 is a little bit too flip, and it implies that this is an upgrade. This is not an upgrade. So there are going to be continuities between the first and second Cold War, and I'm old enough to have actually in the first grade been in a duck and cover drill back in elementary school. But this second Cold War II, will have a few unique features, and I'd like to run through those quickly. First, and this is a bright spot, this is cause for optimism, this is cause for encouragement, is multilateralism. It is a more multilateral world. Multilateralism and the rise of the rest mean that neither China nor the United States can aim for a complete victory of the sort that the United States seemed to have in Cold War I. Allies, partners, even our opponents, all have shifting degrees of commitment to both powers. And many countries and regional groups also now have the experience, they have the tools, they have the agency that they did not have after World War II in the mid-20th century. And that agency will enable them to modify and frustrate the strategies of both major powers in Cold War II. And that could be a good thing. Number two feature of the new Cold War, unless there is a military conflict, in which case, of course, it's no longer cold, then the legacy of 40 years of US-China engagement could put a floor under our mutual hostility. Many of the legacies of engagement are still with us. It has not ceased. Despite the downward trends in public opinion, Chinese and Americans, in my view, have come to know each other and frankly like each other too well for this new set of geostrategic factors to devolve readily into hatred. There's an awful lot of fellow feeling and mutual experience between Chinese and Americans that we didn't have in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. In that realm, Chinese Americans can play a key role in keeping lines of kinship and communication open, and in reminding both sides, the United States in particular, of the historical benefits of openness and interaction. So I think that this large group of extraordinarily talented people, the Chinese American communities, can play a key role, but I also think they're going to come under great pressure in a second Cold War. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. Next, as we go into Cold War II, of course, we have the legacy of the first Cold War, which will inform conduct in the second. We have done a version of this before, not very long ago, in the first Cold War. We have analyzed errors, we have institutionalized some successful practices, and we have socialized around the world a distrust of propaganda and a skepticism about the self-declared motives of major powers. I'm not saying that we are wiser than we were the first time, we're not. But I think that as Cold War veterans, humankind is better equipped to resist some Cold War tactics. Also, China and the US will both be distracted from rivalry by the many transborder problems that they face. And you know this list, it involves pandemics, global warming, different aspects of globalization. I won't go through all of that, but I think you're all aware of the greater environmental issues, the impact of which, the rise of new technologies, pandemics, migration, may mean that yes, while US-China relations are the greatest geostrategic challenge, it may be that humankind's greatest geostrategic challenge is not the greatest challenge we face overall. Can we manage it such that that tempers the Cold War? And then lastly, I think that while the stakes in Cold War II are very high, a full-bore strategic rivalry may not happen. We may not gather steam because of considerable domestic fragility in both China and the United States. Chinese fragility and American fragility are very different in type, but they're very strong. Both nations are highly constrained. So Cold War II may not be winnable, but it can end. And I think the key factor here is going to be change. A Cold War is essentially a play for time. It is an attempt to manage frictions to buy the time required for change to occur or change to be induced in one country, in both, or in external circumstances. If either side during a Cold War comes to believe that it is out of time, that's when the Cold War turns hot. And that's what we need to guard against. So just in closing quickly, why use this phrase Cold War? You know, I have some friends who say, okay, you know, maybe you're right, I see your point, but why say it? It just gins everybody up. It gets them all excited. It produces a lot of really destructive rhetoric, which is true. It's already happening. So why mention it? Well, a couple of reasons. One, I hope I've convinced you that it is an accurate description of the current state of play. And it's always best to be accurate and honest if we can be. Also, calling it Cold War II, I think, lends a focus and a sense of urgency that has been lacking, and helps bring focus to things like US policy in China, in the Northeast Asia, and around the world. Calling it a Cold War compels us to spell out exactly what we want, what we're aiming at, and what we may have to pay to get it. It tends to be conducive to clarity. An awful lot of people in the second Cold War are going to be asked to incur real costs and accept real limitations for a long time. So they need to know what this is and what it's about. They need to know what's at stake. I do think there's a real challenge in the midst of this to temper our rhetoric and not to absolutely demonize the other side. This is where the legacy of engagement comes in. I also think that in this current state of affairs that I've described, while it is true that this idea that it's a Cold War hasn't been broadly socialized, that's true. We're one crisis away. We're one crisis away. And that's likely to fall on the table sooner or later. So it helps us to clarify our goals. And calling it a Cold War also gives us purpose. We're sort of flailing in our policy with China because we don't know what the basis of the relationship is. The basis of our relationship with China right now is to avoid war. That is the overarching goal. Not to make money, although making money off each other sometimes can help you avoid war. Tammy can touch on that. She can agree or disagree. But the goal, once we call it a Cold War, is clearly to keep it cold, to avoid war. We must not go to war with China. We must not fight. And then, of course, once we acknowledge that, that we must not fight, the secondary goal of a Cold War is to end it through managed change and a well-managed relationship. Thank you. I hope I haven't been too depressing.
Robert, that was fascinating, and I look forward to diving in deeper after Yuki makes her comments. Yuki, the microphone is yours.
Great, Tammy, thank you. And after Robert, this is always a very hard act to follow. So I'm going to do my best. First of all, I'd like to thank USAsia Institute for giving me the opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that follows after my remarks and Tammy's comment. So when I think about where Japan is, there's always one phrase that I thought of Japan's foreign policy as it evolves after the end of the Cold War, and that phrase is, "Be careful for what you wish for." And there's unspoken parenthesis after that usually, because once you get it, you may not know what to do with it. I say that because throughout the post-Cold War era, Japan's foreign policy has been driven primarily by its desire to gain the international standing, kind of not to borrow Robert's words, but international standing that commiserates with its economic power. And first Gulf War was a huge shock for Japan that really taught Japanese policymakers that economic power alone, having a strong trade alone, does not bring you that international standing that Japan desires. So since then, Japan has been grappling and trying various ways to figure out what is it that is required for Japan to have that international standing that it desires. That back then it commiserated with its economic power, and now even with the even after the couple of decades, 2 decades, 3 decades of economic rather stagnation and slowdown, Japan still remains to be one of the leading economy in the world. So what does it take for Japan to have that international standing? And this I would argue, last 25, 30 years has been the period of trials and errors. And I think the most recent example of trial and error is former Prime Minister Abe's push, really external push to position Japan as the defender, one of the top defender of a global commons, and the ardent supporter of the liberal international order that not only Japan, but then also the rest of the world benefited from since the end of the World War II. But it was when I was listening to Robert's description of how US and China already has entered a period of a new Cold War, it really kind of gave me the eureka moment that I think throughout that Prime Minister Abe's long tenure, Japan is really grappling to come to term with that reality. That believe it or not, Japan finds itself again in the midst of intense geostrategic competition. And during the first original Cold War, it was US and Soviet Union. And this time, it is between US and China. And China, being Japan's major, huge neighbor, brings a much more complicated and challenging set of challenges for Japan to ponder as it moves forward. So throughout this period, what does Japan wish? Like I said, I think Japan has wished for more higher international standing. But what does that mean? Can Japan execute? And can Japan act with that higher international standing in mind? And then I think this time around, how Japanese government reacted to this current Ukraine crisis is really the demonstration of how Japan came to that realization that regardless of whether it liked it or not, Japan is quickly losing the room for ambiguity in certain policies, in its policy in certain areas that it enjoyed up to very recently. And I'm thinking about the relationship with China, and then also Japan's relationship with Russia. And Japan, of course, is a strong supporter of current international liberal order. However, when it comes to certain countries, Japan has its own bilateral complexities and challenges that it grapples with. And Russia is one of those. Yes, Japan looks at Russia with its great concern, but at the same time, Russia is one of the few countries that Japan still has to settle the unresolved issue from World War II. So therefore, Japan has always treaded very carefully when it comes to Russia in terms of make sure that it anchors itself firmly in the Western alliance system when it comes to the issues like its position on the issues like human rights, democracy, support for democracy, and things like that. But at the same time, it also has sought to leave just a sliver of maneuvering room so that it can still have those bilateral negotiations with Russia on those outstanding issues. And China, being a big neighbor of Japan, brings its own complication. The two economies are very intertwined. But at the same time, Japan has very acute security concerns when it comes to China. So this is another be careful for what you wish for moment for Japan. For years, Japanese policymakers, especially for those who was in the security and defense policy realm, has been really frustrated about US ambiguity in its policy toward China. Its leaders has repeatedly sought the clarification that Article 5 of the Mutual Security Treaty will cover Senkaku Island, which Japan faces challenges from China pretty much every day now, and the challenge is intensifying. But now that U.S. Starts to speak more openly about need for defending Taiwan, or building a stronger coalition against what China tries to achieve in terms of exporting its own model of world order, Japan finds itself in a conundrum that it still needs to manage its relationship with China as well. And its business being intertwined, Robert really put the finger on a really important issue that not just Japan, but the other US allies and partners around the world is grappling with, is this decoupling that seems to be happening, that increasingly Japan finds itself in a position that it has to choose, but it may not necessarily want to choose. But what do you do with that when you aspire and it identifies itself as the chief defender of global commons and the one of the ardent supporter of those liberal international order. So I think that is the challenge that Japanese government has undergone under Prime Minister Abe, and the challenge is still evolving now with the Prime Minister Kishida at the top. And looking out for Japan, prescription for Japan is not great either, because Japan now faces these really complex challenges, very daunting challenges, with two variants that are very, very different from the last time, from the Cold War last time around. In the original Cold War, Japan looked at US as the older brother, stronger brother in the alliance relationship. It had confidence in the US aspiration to continue to play a leading role, maybe not necessarily a world's policeman, but definitely an architect and the defender of the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. But with the recent evolution that happened in the United States, both externally and within the United States, Japan's confidence in the United States may not be as rock solid as it was back then. And also Japan looks at itself with shrinking population, more aging population, and because of that, inevitably shrinking economic pie, still has to deal with these multi-layered, complicated challenges in the middle of intensifying geostrategic competition or a new Cold War, whatever you call it, that is going on with the US and China. So Japan now has come to the choice that the only way for Japan to navigate through this time is to align itself much more closer with the US and its allies and partners around the globe, and stand up for those principles that it has continued to talk so many years that it holds to dear. And I think the swiftness in the Prime Minister Kishida's announcement about the Japan's first tranche of Japan's economic sanction against Russia and those two separatist regions really doesn't miss within less than 24 hours after US came out with it, is the demonstration of that's the choice that Japan has made. And then I think Japan will do its best to navigate through that, and by aligning itself closer with the United States, NATO allies, and then EU, and for other countries like Australia and in India, who they can work with to continue to uphold the existing international order. So I'll stop at that, and over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Yuki, for that very comprehensive analysis. Let me just make a few observations about Korea, and then we'll get the Q&A going. Please, if you've got questions, type them in the chat function or send a note to Alec. So South Korea, they characterize themselves as a shrimp between the whales, strategically located between China and Japan. They're very much influenced by both. China is Korea's largest trade partner. The US, of course, we're their key security partner. And then you have Japan, which is a very important partner, but they're burdened by this historical baggage. One of the things I read this week that surprised me, I had never seen this before, the Korean government is now tracking South Korean semiconductor engineers who are being heavily recruited by the Chinese. I mean, China's made no secret that they want to play big in the semiconductor space. Korea's been incredibly successful there. And so now you have the Korean government tracking these key personnel assets, their travel and potential job offers from China. I mentioned a little bit about the historical baggage between Korea and Japan. They have a long history, early 20th century Japanese occupation. Koreans are still quite frustrated with that. There in 1965, a treaty was signed. Japan paid reparations to Korea. Fast forward to the last couple of years, and we see individual Korean citizens filing charges, lawsuits against Japanese companies over forced labor. And the Korean courts giving those lawsuits weight. One of the deep concerns I have is that the first time a South Korean court takes Japanese assets, assets of a Japanese company, that's a huge red line that's going to cause enormous problems. So, however, there is a little blue spot on the horizon. Korea has an election March 9th for president. It's a single 5-year term. But with a new president, whether it's the current Progressive Party or the opposition Conservative Party, it will offer an opportunity for a reset of the Korea-Japan relationship. It also is quite important that in every high-level Biden meeting between the US and Japan or the US and Korea, the last line of all of those fact sheets emphasizes the importance of this trilateral relationship, that Korea, Japan, and the United States need to work together. So that's very encouraging. It's also interesting to me that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is considered a fairly lower standard regional trade agreement, but it is an agreement that includes about 1/3 of the world and about 1/3 of the world's GDP. And it includes 15 countries, the 10 ASEANs, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, and China. So it's the only agreement that has Japan, China, and Korea in it together. And one of the outcomes of an agreement like RCEP is there will be annual meetings at different levels. So you're going to have trade ministers meeting, but you're also going to have the leaders meeting. This is going to provide more opportunity, I think, for further integration between these three very important economies. Let's see. Also, I thought it was interesting to have with both the Biden Japan summit and the Biden Korea summits last spring, they both included lines on defending Taiwan. I think that's reflective of the growing concern. And again, while Robert gave some chilling words, I think he just put voice to what those in the business community that I deal with every day. We already know we're in a Cold War. Our companies have been facing it since we had these tariffs. And then, of course, we had the retaliatory tariffs. We have about $380 billion worth of trade between the US and China that are being affected by tariffs. And regretfully, I think President Trump was mistaken when he said, this is money that the Chinese are paying the US. That's actually inaccurate. These tariffs are paid by consumers or by the US companies that are importing those goods. So it is something that is damaging us all. I think right now, probably the best thing we can do is go to Q&A. And while you're thinking about yours, we have a question from the audience. All right, let me see. All right. What areas can the US cooperate with China to help de-escalate tensions? Robert, that's clearly in your area.
Sure. Well, there are a lot of areas in which we could cooperate with China in theory to de-escalate tensions. It is very, very difficult, in fact. We have floated some ideas to China, and China has said, look, you really can't cooperate with us in these areas while you are attacking us and harming our interests and threatening our security in others. We're simply not going to play that way. You don't get to give us a pat on the back with one arm while you give us a rabbit punch in the ribs with the others. And you can, the Chinese view isn't hard to understand. But of course, Americans aren't so good at shutting up, right? We are genuinely concerned about real repression within China. Xi Jinping has gone back to sort of Maoist tactics in many ways. He has locked Uyghurs up in, these, what do we call them? They're prisons, concentration camps. Tibet that has a whole slate of human rights problems, been with us for decades. The mainland China is threatening Taiwan. They have broken their promise to the UK and have really made Hong Kong just another Chinese city. And China is spreading illiberal practices around the world. So we've got real concerns that we're not likely to shut up about. And China's saying we're not going to play ball, even in areas of mutual interest, under those circumstances. So right now it's a stalemate. And this is really destructive. There are places that we could work. China, they just had a big COP 20, I don't remember which number it was.
26.
26 down in
Yeah.
Yunnan. And China, which has a dreadful environmental record and is home to, I think, still the most bird species in the world and had rich flora and fauna. Because of pollution and the expansion of human habitats, species have been disappearing quickly. But China has said, and I think it's sincere, that it wants to be a leader on biodiversity. It wants to now get its act together. It's building national parks. It wants to protect the species that it has. Great, wonderful. That is non-political in the extreme. And in my view, we should be all over that. What can we do? How can we help? What knowledge can we share? I don't think that's happening. COVID is the other big one. And here we face a policy dilemma that is of our making and China's making as well. And it goes like this. I think it's illustrative of the kind of issue we have in US-China relations now. We have been insisting, in the name of global public health, human well-being, that China allow an international, wholly scientific, objective, unfettered examination in China into the origins of COVID, in the name of public health. And China has been denying that, which is odious. Okay, this has nothing to do with whether it was a lab leak or where it came from. The fact is they are denying what global public health clearly requires. And we've been asking for it in the name of public health. Okay, but also in the name of public health, we have to work closely with China now to prevent the next pandemic, which is also likely to come from China. But we can't, in the name of public health, work with them on the next pandemic if we're still insisting on trying to figure out where COVID began, a real policy dilemma. Can we, should we, stop talking about the origins of COVID in order to get back involved in each other's CDCs to prevent the next pandemic, which may well come from China and could be worse? That's a real problem. If anybody out there listening has a good answer, please supply it. But that's the kind of issue we face.
Thank you. Yuki, do you think Taiwan will be a point that the Quad will take a stronger stance on? Would the US and Japan encourage more cooperation between India, Australia, and Taiwan? And if yes, what steps have they taken or do you think are being taken to accomplish this?
I think, thanks, Tammy. And this is a very good question as well. Taiwan is another point where Japan has come to a realization that it really may not have that much of a wiggle room when it comes to its policy stance. And more Japanese political leaders have become more open about talking about how the threat to Taiwan democracy is not just regional crisis for Japan. It will directly impact Japanese national security. So that is a sea change that I've been seeing in the Japanese discourse on Taiwan. Going back to the Quad, I would argue that rather than the Quad, I think it is more likely to see more concrete action, whether that may be the attempt to engage Taiwan in various policy areas in the US, Japan, Australia framework. Australia is really coming, Australia's perception and its relationship with Taiwan is becoming very similar to that of Japan, as China, China does not hesitate to use its economic strong arm to impose certain things on China, impose certain things on Australia, like banning Australian wine and things like that. But in light of that, so Quad for the moment, I think actually is in one area. I found the comment about the public health issues that Robert mentioned about very interesting, because that is actually one of the very specific area that the Quad has actually already begun to work with. It does have a working group on a vaccine development and distribution amongst the Quad, providing assistance to the Southeast Asia and other parts of the world in terms of supplying the vaccines. So if there is it will be an ideal situation if Quad and China can find some way in cooperating on that distribution of vaccine realm without try to pursue this answer to where this COVID started question. And that could open, maybe if not on the COVID, that may allow a certain political cover between Quad and China to have at least a preliminary conversation about what can be done to prevent another pandemic and what happens, what can be done about that. But to answer that, directly answer that question, I really don't know whether specifically India, how far India is willing to go to have a more clarity on the stance toward Taiwan. I think Australia is closer when it's willingness and openness to have a more clarity in its position to Japan and the United States. So I think potential is greater within U.S., Japan, Australia framework, and I would actually argue U.S., Japan, NATO, or like European cooperation. I think it's more doable, especially because European engagement in Indo-Pacific, and then also issues like Taiwan, and getting them articulate their support for Taiwan is a very good, useful and helpful peacetime deterrent vis-a-vis China.
Robert, you want to make any follow-on comments on Taiwan?
Only, I agree with what Yuki has said. We do need to be careful, I think, to continue to manage the Taiwan issue credibly within a one China framework. I said that our overarching goal has to be not to go to war with China, and the area that is most likely to happen in is Taiwan. And one of the ways that one of the things that might trigger that is if China became convinced, and they're getting there now, that we're not really committed to the Taiwan, the one China policy. And we have been flirting, I think, dangerously with overthrowing that policy, and we have not been doing enough through diplomacy to try to reassure China. We're doing the deterrence piece. The deterrence piece is extremely important. We haven't been doing the reassurance piece. And we need to, start to gin up our diplomacy again and get back in the business of credibly reassuring China.
Thank you. Yuki, Francisco asks, with multiple reports indicating that China's Belt and Road Initiative is staggering with corruption, debt, and poor standards, how can the U.S. work with Japan and other regional allies to counter this infrastructure and economic initiative by China?
Great question. And I would actually point it back to Quad, because one of the 4, 5, I think 6 areas that the Quad has now focusing on is one of them is quality infrastructure in all parts of the world. And US and Japan has long talked about it and actually have been coordinating its approaches to infrastructure development in the region. Japan and India, the same thing. So for the last, as we are seeing the inevitable realization in the recipients of those Belt and Road Initiative assistance, about what it actually is. It often leads to economic, I guess, a predatory economic policy, as couched by the Secretary Mattis in the previous administration. Japan has been working to provide more attractive alternative, which is quality infrastructure, more transparent, actually does lead to developing indigenous economy in the recipient country. And of course, a massive cash inflow from China for those projects is always a challenge, because by dollar, China's size of that cash influx really dwarfs whatever Japan and its partners have been trying to do. But what's working for Japan, US, Japan, and its partners in the region right now is that those recipient countries starts to realize that. And one example would be Indonesia, Indonesia canceling the high-speed contract with China, which it originally signed, due to, for the reason that are anchoring in those lack of transparency and other concerns that we have always talked about. So I think US, Japan, and the more market democracies really need to take advantage, optimize this opening, and really try to work hard to provide that alternative to the countries and the region that it needs that quality infrastructure for their sustainable economic development.
Thank you, Robert. If America increases multilateral security dialogue in the Pacific, do you think it will spur further aggression from China?
Depends what we mean by multilateral. There are different fora that we could use, and some of them should include China. Now, again, this is not something we're ready to do right now, because we're seeing China only through a security lens with extreme distrust, most of which China has earned. However, you can't wish China away. It is building up its military capabilities very quickly, and it has a huge advantage in the Western Pacific over the United States in the area of proximity. Steaming times to potential trouble spots are much quicker from China than they are from San Diego or Honolulu. And China may also have a big advantage of will. China also in the region, and this is where it gets really tricky. This is why you're going to keep hearing me say diplomacy, 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 patient, persistent diplomacy. We have to recognize that not only will China not go away, but that China also has legitimate interests in the security of the sea lanes in the Western Pacific that it relies on for its food, its raw materials, and its energy. Right now, the United States and its allies can close down China's sea lanes, its access in time of war, if we chose to, from unsinkable land bases. The fact that China is uncomfortable about this, that's a perfectly reasonable thing, right? Any country of China's size and wealth and capability would not want to rely on the good graces of the United States to keep its sea lanes open, but would like to play a bigger role. So if we start there, we have to say that China has some security interests in the area. We have to be open to talking about that too. So yes, we should work multilaterally. We need to draw closer to ASEAN. Japan is our absolutely key central ally, and South Korea isn't as capable as Japan, but also vital. But multilateral discussions need to include the most powerful country in the region, or we'll be setting ourselves up for a big fall, in my view. Not every forum needs to include China. Sometimes it's important not to have them in the room, but there should be some forum in which we do speak with China.
Got it. Megan asks, what can the US, South Korea, or Japan do to combat Chinese imposed tariffs in their human rights abuses? Let me just start with South Korea. When the US-China trade war began with Trump applying all of these tariffs, South Korean companies who were manufacturing in China got hit as well. And what South Korea's response to that was, they have a look south policy, or a new southern policy, where they have really focused on increasing their investment in ASEAN. So they have, in fact, most of their investment in ASEAN has gone into Vietnam. where they are a massive foreign investor. But they have used that as a manufacturing hub to be able to send products to the United States that are not tariffed. And regarding human rights abuses, South Korea is very wary of challenging China head on. I mean, they've got so much trade with China by a large margin that they're gonna, where they can, they have a strategic ambiguity policy that they're gonna be forced, I think, to bring more clarity to. But let me turn to Yuki or to Richard and see what y'all think. Or Robert, I'm sorry.
That is a very tough question because human rights Japan often struggles with how to manifest its support for global human rights issue while not overly antagonizing China necessarily. Like all of us, Japan's economy is very much intertwined with that of Chinese. Japanese businesses have been accelerating its diversification of its manufacturing hubs and supply chain networks, but then still China still holds the attractiveness as its big market. But like I said, I think Japan is really, especially for those who are in the foreign policy realm, on the more of a security policy realm, is really quickly realizing that it is hard for Japan to not to support US and other European countries' stance on human rights issues more openly, and still hopes to I guess get a support from the their US and its partners on the issues that they, as in terms of Japan, cares. So they're increasingly realizing that they can no longer, window is closing for them to be able to remain ambiguous on certain issues. And I think human rights is definitely one of them. But I think they haven't really figured out the good mix of policy tools to achieve what Megan asks yet.
Robert, you want to add anything?
Well, only that I think, Yuki's right, but I don't think that mix of policy tools exists. One of the reasons, in part because China is now very insistent on what it sees as its own prerogatives and hypersensitive to anything seen as an insult of Chinese policy. So, this is one of the reasons that I think we need a real clarity in our framing, to understand that this is a Cold War and that it's high stakes. And the reason we need to understand this is that we don't manage this relationship well in America's national interest and the interests of our friends and allies without incurring some real costs. Oxes are going to be gored. There is simply no having it both ways. If it's true that this is a long-term geostrategic global struggle in all of these realms, there are going to be areas of cooperation, including very lucrative commercial cooperation with China, which, because of human rights or because of the ways in which they build Chinese capabilities, are no longer going to be tenable. And there are going to be real costs. Everybody's trying to find some magic formula, something that makes it okay, such that, well, can we be completely good and be good ESG investors and satisfy our young employees and protect the Uyghurs, while still making money hand over fist in China? Answer, no. There may be some sectors in which it's easier than in others. I hope that there are, but these pressures are not going to go away, and there isn't any magic bullet given the nature of the forces and the concerns that are relied on both sides. Right now, most companies, and Tammy, you may disagree, they're really just, we talked about duck and cover, they're in duck and cover mode. They're just hiding and hoping that when the music stops, the finger isn't pointing at them in China, right? That they somehow avoid this, which isn't really a plan, because they're highly exposed in China, they're highly profitable in China. But as I said, we're one crisis away from a catastrophic collapse in relations. And by that, I mean not necessarily war, but I mean something like almost all the American companies leave there and almost all the Chinese students leave here.
Wow.
This could happen fast. And so as good fiduciaries, they need to be thinking a little bit more about that. And again, I don't mean that as a threat. I'm not saying pick up tent stakes and leave right now. There are a lot of good effects that come from trade with China, but they need a better plan than just hoping it doesn't happen to them. I know, Tammy, does that overstate the case?
No, it actually doesn't. We obviously have a lot of clients doing business in China, and we're constantly doing crisis scenario building. What happens when, the PRC, the Communist Party, points their finger at you? Or the reverse, what happens when the Biden team says, you haven't given us sufficient proof that your goods didn't come from Xinjiang, and that they weren't made with forced labor. So it's a real dilemma. And so many of American companies, their profits are coming from China. You talked to Robert earlier about the potential technology and financial divide. That scares me so much. And I think you're absolutely spot on. It is a clear and present threat. But if that happens and there is a real divide, U.S. companies are, their biggest markets are in China. That's where they're making the profits. What happens then? I don't know. Well, let's go to another question. Eric Good says, if China becomes increasingly isolated from its regional neighbors, is it at risk of taking military actions, or will it just saber rattle? What does your crystal ball say?
Well, for now, most of the countries in the region, all of whom share Japan's and South Korea's fears to some degree, also value their economic relationship with China for the reasons that have already been discussed. And so their preferred mode is hedging. China for the economics, America for security. China is very good at playing on these concerns. And so China will, it's not in their interest, although they're capable of doing it anyway, of doing something that absolutely closes the door on these trade relations. Also, China has, pretty good relations with a lot of ASEAN. It is a major provider of global public goods in Central Asia when it looks west. It could potentially, we'll wait and see, play a positive role in Afghanistan, but it's generally seen as playing a positive role in the stands, and increasingly is close to Russia. It has good relations not only with Iran, but also with Saudi and Egypt and Syria and Israel. It's making great inroads in the Middle East, and it is doing not so badly in Latin America and Africa. Those are very, very complex stories, country by country, case by case. But overall, China has made gains in these regions. In the developed and democratic world, China's views of China continue to decline, and to decline very rapidly. But in the rest of the world, China's doing well. And they're the story, there's a problem with BRI and things about aspects of China's presence. But the real story is the story of American absence, of America's ignoring much of the world and just focusing on the parts that are pleasing to us. And that's where China's making inroads. So the question is correct that China has been worrying and defending and threatening and coercing an awful lot of countries. We don't read as much in our papers about the places that China is making inroads, and we need to be more attentive to that.
That's a perfect segue for Yuki. A question on the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Did anything stand out to you in the Biden administration's recently released information, the fact sheets, and what does that strategy mean for Japan and Northeast Asia?
That's a great question. So first of all, I think my first reaction when I was reading that was in the middle of when Ukrainian tension was rising. So yes, this is a good strategy to read. It's calming that finally there seems to be a coherent strategy that are coming out of the White House looking at this Indo-Pacific region. However, Indo-Pacific region has been experiencing this. This is not new. Administration after administration, I can go back to probably 43rd Bush administration, that president from on down emphasizes the strategic importance of Asia. But in reality, in a policy execution, gets completely distracted by the developments, more immediate developments that happens on the other side of the world. And during 8 years of a Bush administration and large chunk of the Obama administration, that elsewhere was Afghanistan and Iraq. During the Trump administration, it was just looking inward and putting allies in the position of prove your worth and pay up if you want us to stay, kind of very transactional approach. And today, as we all know, it's Ukraine. But I think that this one is different in the sense that I think there is an awareness on the U.S. side that what U.S. does in this Ukraine situation is being very closely watched, not just by the rest of the world, but in particularly by China.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Let me also add that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it's not a trade agreement. There are going to be different modules. Perhaps the trade and investment module will have some enforceability. It'll be binding in some way, but we don't know. We don't have details on that. This is going to be an a la carte menu that different countries can pick and choose which modules they want. But from my selfish perspective, TPP was really designed to help encourage China to take good behavior. When I used to, at the chamber, lead the U.S. business delegations to all of the TPP rounds, when I came back to Washington, my very first meeting would always be with the Chinese embassy. And it went from very cold and suspicious to, and I was quite blunt and clear. There's no state secret here. We want China to join, but we want you to join at the same high standard as all the other countries, and we want you to honor the agreement. But if you're able to do that, you'll be welcome. And then China would say, and their position really softened over time. Then it went from, okay, we want to join, but we want to lower the standards a little bit. And, I had the perfect response. If a country like Vietnam can accept these comprehensive high standards, certainly a great country like China can. At which point my interlocutors would say, more alcohol, let's keep talking. But now we're in a position where China is very serious about joining CPTPP. They've translated the entire text into Mandarin. They've done a detailed gap analysis. They know exactly what they need to do, and they're moving in that direction. Now, is it going to be an easy negotiation? Heck no, it's going to take a long time, but at least they're in the game. And oh, by the way, they've got the moral high ground of saying, they support international standards. They want trade agreements, and the U.S. does not have a seat at these important rule writing tables. I'll get off my soapbox now and go to another question. Let's see. Do you think if Putin carries out a successful occupation of Ukraine without significant Western resistance, that it could possibly encourage Beijing to be more aggressive toward Taiwan? Robert, we'll start with you, and Yuki, I'll ask if you have any points on that as well.
I understand the concern about why it might. Of course, there will be resistance from the West. It won't be armed resistance. We already know that. And a successful occupation of Ukraine, that's a long shot on a number of grounds. There is an excellent, what I'm going to do is refer you to an excellent article that was published today in the National Interest website. National Interest Online, by Ambassador Stapleton Roy, my colleague at the Wilson Center, and Michael Swain, who's at the Quincy Institute. They're writing on this precisely this question, and I think it's a superb article. It is clarity itself, and better, than listen to me is read that article, Michael Swain and Stapleton Roy, in today's online, free, not paywalled, National Interest. Take a look at that.
Cool. Yuki, any comments?
I think I guess I'll go back to my initial remarks that I made at the beginning of the session. That is precisely what's driving Japanese response this time. That how Japan reacts to this is closely watched. China watches it closely, and how U.S. and Japan and other Western countries respond to this is being watched very, very closely. And Japan is just not thinking about Taiwan. It's thinking about East China Sea. Mm-hmm. And it's also thinking about South China Sea. And it also thinks about how South China Sea, a few years ago, when China started building up those islands, how it never really met the meaningful physical resistance or any kind of resistance, and basically created a new normal. And Japan does want to avoid another one of those. So I think that really is driving Japan's reaction this time, which is very, very different from how Japan responded to Russian annexation of Crimea about 10 years ago.
Interesting. Sarah has asked, I mentioned that South Korea avoids confronting China head on, but with the recent the presidential election, the candidates have been taking a more hardline approach towards China as anti-Chinese sentiment has grown on the peninsula, especially among the younger generations. How do I think the election will affect the China-ROK relations in the long term? I think both candidates are absolutely going to take a hard line, much like in US Congress. That's one of the few issues that we can find bipartisan support, is that the US needs to be strong on China. That's true in Korea as well. And it's been interesting, Korea was one of the first countries that got hit by economic coercion when the US put a high altitude THAAD anti-missile battery on the peninsula. China reacted immediately, and the Hyundai cars, Lotte department stores, and a lot of other Korean companies felt the wrath of China. So they're very familiar with that. Korean companies have significant investments in China. So they will be quietly reminding whichever leader is elected that, please don't blow up this important relationship. And I see no more new questions. So Robert, if you'll permit me, I just wanted to ask if you could share a little bit more about if we have a bifurcation of, let's just start with technology, what would that look like? And, how do you think it would play out? And then Yuki, I'm going to flip it to you. How would Japan respond to that? Robert, over to you.
Well, it has to do with which companies set the standards for 5G, 6G. What is going to guide AI, especially as the Internet of Things becomes a reality. In general, there are global standards, right? So that our cell phones work more or less everywhere. We are, the United States is very strongly opposed to Chinese standards for a couple of reasons. Obviously, commercial self-interest is one of them, although it's probably the least defensible, in part because we don't have a company that can really compete with Huawei, and that's not China's fault, that's on us. But also as a matter of security and as a matter of data management, that if Chinese companies control these standards and therefore sell the equipment around the world, that China will have access to all of the information and also will have all of the data, which it can then use through machine deep learning to train better algorithms and keep moving even faster. So the United States and its allies have had some success in keeping Huawei out of, again, developed democracies. In other countries, Huawei really does order the most affordable, good enough option to get this connectivity to people who badly need it, and let's face it, whose lives could be transformed by it, right? But we're not comfortable with that, and will not be signing on to a Chinese run system. And that will likely mean some coalition of other countries. It would include Northern Europe, it would include Japan, it would include South Korea and Taiwan and the United States, having separate systems that could not be tapped into. And those, by their very nature, have to be mutually exclusive. And it's that kind of mutual exclusivity clause, which you might also find, say, in an alternative payment system to SWIFT, that would force countries that don't want to put their chips on red or black. Is that avoidable? That's a technical question that I don't have the expertise to answer. Is there some fix for that? I don't know, but that seems to be where we are headed now.
Yuki, what's your thought on Robert's prediction? You're on mute.
Sorry. I think that is the nightmare scenario almost, that Japanese business communities are trying to get their heads around. What if that moment comes where
Right, we're not there yet.
Right. What if that moment comes? Because you're right. I mean, Robert is right. We're not there yet, but all the indication seems to be things are heading more or less that way. And what does it do? Government doesn't have a good answer for it. Business definitely is still trying to get their heads around it. Japanese government did start to have some kind of a framework under the name of economic security. The government just submitted the economic security law legislation that at least involves some protection measures about data, information, and then also rather belatedly, there could include the clause on the security system that are akin to our security clearance system for those who touch those sensitive technologies. But those are in response to the need that the government is feeling to prep its system for that. There might be a day that comes that there are all these requirements to do business with, not just with the United States, but then the other countries, like in European countries, that agree essentially with that standard and work off of the same standard. But obviously, they don't want to choose. They don't want to have to do that. Quite a stark choice of red or black. But they are at least getting to be ready themselves for it. And then, by the way, that is another thing. That data management is, I think, one of the group focus groups that the Quad has launched as well. So we'll see how that discussion in that realm goes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, are there any more questions before we flip it back to Alec? I think we've gotten everything that I saw in the chat. I just want to offer my special thanks for Robert and Yuki. And Alec, you might want to consider a topic about the bifurcation that the red or black choice that Robert has grimly laid out, because I mean, that's definitely something I would like to watch if you can get some people wiser than me, but perhaps Robert and his friends and Yuki to talk more about. And with that, let me thank you both and flip it back to Alex for closing remarks.
Thank you, Tammy. Oh, there we go. I'd also like to second that thought, Robert. Hopefully we can have further discussion on that topic, and Yuki as well. We can see what we can do moving forward for this series and other discussions. So Tammy, I greatly appreciate you stepping in to moderate today. Giving both your perspective and leading our discussion was both impressive and fascinating to listen to. So thank you for that. And I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Robert and Yuki for both joining us today and providing their excellent insight. What you laid out was certainly the perfect groundwork for the rest of this new public series. So hopefully we'll have more focus sessions soon on different issue areas in the context of Northeast Asia, and we'll have more people to join us. We were honored to host you, and I and the USAI Institute really appreciate the time you've taken out of your busy schedules to deliver your valuable perspectives. So it's always a pleasure hosting you three. Although we're out of time, we present the opportunity for those tuning in with interest in US-Asia relations to reach out to the Institute if they have questions relevant to our future events for this public webinar series. And if anyone in the audience would also like to follow up with any of our speakers, they could reach out to USAI@usasiainstitute.org, and we'd be happy to assist you in further fostering dialogue on the issues we discussed today. Now, for congressional staff who are still tuning in right now, who are also interested in Northeast Asia relations, our next roundtable for the U.S.-Japan 2022 briefing series, co-hosted by the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Institute, will be in person and hosted at the U.S. Institute in the next few weeks. So the details are still being finalized, and the nature and the topics of the roundtable are still being finalized as well. However, lunch will be served. Interested congressional staff will have the opportunity to engage directly with the embassy and U.S.-Japan experts in an off-the-record setting. So we invite you to that. For our friends who are also congressional staff interested in U.S.-China relations, we are hosting virtual delegations with Chinese officials, businesses, and scholars next month on China's economic model. So we're trying to help staffers understand the nuances and differences that demonstrate, what Chinese perceive as the values and mechanisms of their system, and how to define Chinese socialism and internal economic strategy to American counterparts. So please note that for these in-person sessions that they are limited. So if you are very interested, please send an email to the email I posted to the chat. We'd definitely like to reserve space for you if possible. So thanks to everyone again for joining us today, and I hope they have a wonderful rest of your day. So thank you, everyone.